Okay, move.
I paid $3,100 a month for a mortgage, but my parents gave the house to my sister. I've always thought that life was about balance, about giving and receiving in equal measure. Growing up, though, I learned quickly that balance wasn't a concept my family adhered to. I was the eldest, the dependable one, the one who always had to do the right thing, while my younger sister Emily got away with practically everything. Our childhood set the tone for how things would play out later. While I was burdened with chores, responsibilities, and expectations, Emily danced through life carefree, a golden child shielded from consequence. My parents always assured me this was because I was more responsible, but even as a kid, I saw through that excuse. Emily was their favorite, plain and simple. Fast forward to adulthood, and not much had changed. I worked tirelessly to carve out a career as a programmer. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I landed a solid job with a steady income. I moved out of my parents' house and rented a small apartment with my girlfriend, Rachel. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and it was the first real taste of independence I'd had. Rachel and I had big dreams, saving up for a home, building a future together, and leaving behind the baggage of my childhood. But just when I thought I was free, my parents pulled me back in. My dad, with his usual persuasive charm, laid out a pitch. They needed help buying a house. "It'll be an investment," he said. "We'll pay you back in the long run." Of course, they didn't ask Emily. Why would they? She was still flitting between part-time jobs and treating life like one big vacation. I hesitated. Rachel wasn't thrilled about the idea, and neither was I, but the guilt tactics were relentless. My dad reminded me of everything they'd done for me growing up, as though feeding and clothing me was some extraordinary favor rather than a basic parental responsibility. Against my better judgment, I agreed. They assured me it would be temporary, just until they got on their feet. That temporary turned into a monthly mortgage payment of $3,100. Every single month, I sent off that check, watching my dreams of owning a home with Rachel slip further out of reach. We tightened our budget, cut back on trips, and put off plans for the future. Meanwhile, Emily's life continued untouched. She'd drop by my parents' house for dinner, brag about her latest adventures, and leave without contributing a dime. I tried not to resent her, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of the imbalance. For years, I told myself it was worth it. After all, it was for family. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being used. That feeling turned into a harsh reality one Sunday afternoon. My parents invited me over for lunch, something they hadn't done in a while. I thought it might be a chance to reconnect, to maybe discuss how much longer this mortgage situation would last. Instead, they dropped a bombshell. Over dessert, my dad casually mentioned that the house I'd been paying for was now in Emily's name, and she was moving in. He added, almost too casually, that they had already rented a small apartment nearby for themselves. Emily needed stability, he said, as if that justified it. It's better for her future. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what I just heard. Years of hard work, of sacrifices, of putting my dreams on hold. All for a house that wasn't even mine. Emily hadn't contributed a cent, and yet she reaped the ultimate reward. The unfairness of it all hit me like a tidal wave, but what hurt the most was a betrayal. My parents had used me, plain and simple, and they didn't even seem to care. That night, as I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the stack of bills on the kitchen table, something inside me snapped. I'd spent my entire life putting others first, bending over backward to meet their expectations. For what? To be cast aside when it no longer suited them? It was time to take a stand. If my family thought they could walk all over me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning, I decided to confront the reality of my situation head-on. If my parents and Emily had no qualms about betraying me, then I owed it to myself to uncover the full extent of their deception. The first step was to check on the mortgage, the one I'd been dutifully paying for years. I figured it was time to understand exactly where my money had gone. At the bank, I requested a detailed account of the mortgage payments. The banker handed me a thick stack of documents, and as I flipped through them, my heart sank. The payments were all there, every single dollar I'd worked so hard to earn. But buried in the fine print was something I hadn't expected: large withdrawals that didn't match the loan terms. It didn't take long for me to piece it together. The extra payments I'd been making, the ones my parents claimed were to pay off the mortgage faster, hadn't gone to the house at all. Instead, those funds had been funneled into a separate account used to pay for their new apartment. My hands shook as I stared at the evidence. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. Not only had they manipulated me into sacrificing my own financial future, but they'd also lied outright about where my money was going. All the while, they'd been setting up a comfortable life for themselves at my expense. The audacity of it left me reeling. By the time I left the bank, my mind was racing with a mix of anger and disbelief. I couldn't go on like this, being their pawn, their endless source of financial support. I needed answers, but more importantly, I needed to confront them about their actions. When I got home, I called my dad and told him we needed to talk. He agreed to meet me at a local coffee shop later that afternoon. The meeting was tense from the start. My dad arrived with his usual air of nonchalance, as though he hadn't just upended my life. I wasted no time laying the documents on the table, pointing out the discrepancies and demanding an explanation. At first, he tried to brush it off, saying it was all for the family and that I should trust them. But when I pressed him, his demeanor shifted. He admitted they'd used my money to rent their new place, reasoning that it was necessary because they couldn't live with Emily forever. He didn't apologize or show any remorse. Instead, he acted as though I was being unreasonable for questioning their decisions. We needed to do what was best for everyone, he said, as if that justified the blatant dishonesty. The sheer audacity of his response left me speechless. My sacrifices, my hard work, my dreams, all of it had been dismissed as collateral damage in their quest for what was best. I'd spent years convincing myself that my family's needs outweighed my own, but in that moment, I realized the truth. They had never considered my needs at all. I left the coffee shop without saying another word. There was nothing left to discuss. The weight of their betrayal was suffocating. But beneath the hurt, a new resolve was forming. I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. For the first time in my life, I was ready to put myself first. The betrayal wasn't just a single act. It was a pattern my parents had cultivated at my expense. After years of living under their expectations, I was done. The first step was stopping the mortgage payments. If Emily wanted the house so badly, she could figure out how to keep it herself. That evening, I sent a formal notice to the bank, ending my financial responsibility for the house. It felt liberating, like breaking free from chains I'd worn for too long. Rachel supported my decision, proud I was standing up for myself. For the first time in years, I saw a chance to reclaim my life. My parents reacted immediately. The phone calls began, first my dad, reasoning and guilt-tripping, then my mom, pleading and emotional. They painted themselves as victims, insisting they'd sacrificed everything for me. But their manipulative undertones were impossible to ignore. This time, I held firm. When the calls became incessant, I blocked them. Cutting off contact with my parents wasn't easy, but their betrayal left no alternative. Rachel reminded me I deserved better than being treated like a walking ATM. Her support was my anchor. Then Emily stepped in. She was blunt and unapologetic, accusing me of ruining her life. She claimed that without my financial support, she'd lose the house. Her entitlement was infuriating, as though I owed her stability just because we were siblings. Her accusations stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed the deep rift in our family. Emily had always been shielded from responsibility, while I bore the burden. Now, even a minor inconvenience had her blaming me. The tension peaked during a confrontation when Emily showed up at my apartment unannounced. She twisted the narrative to paint me as the villain tearing the family apart. Her words were sharp, but for the first time, I stood my ground. I made it clear my days of being the family's scapegoat were over. As she stormed out, slamming the door, I felt a mix of anger and relief. Her selfishness hurt, but setting boundaries was a long overdue step. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to navigate. For the first time in years, I felt free. When the bank took over the house, it was like watching a house of cards collapse. My parents, so confident in their ability to control the situation, were left scrambling. The property was listed for auction within weeks, and with no one to pick up the financial slack, the foreclosure process moved swiftly. My parents, who had once painted themselves as pillars of strength, suddenly found themselves without a roof over their heads. Emily was the first to feel the brunt of the fallout. Her carefree existence crumbled as the reality of losing the house set in. She tried to hold on, attempted to negotiate with the bank, but without a steady income or a financial safety net, her efforts were futile. When the eviction notice came, she had no choice but to pack up and leave. The golden child, who had always been protected from the consequences of her actions, was now experiencing them in full force. In a twist that even I didn't expect, my parents turned on her. They'd spent years propping her up, but when their own comfort was threatened, they didn't hesitate to shift the blame. Emily, who had always been their favorite, suddenly found herself alone. The betrayal stung her deeply, and for once, she got a taste of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their manipulation. Watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. A part of me felt vindicated. After years of being the one to shoulder every burden, it was almost satisfying to see the dynamic shift. But another part of me struggled with guilt. Despite everything they'd done, these were still my parents and my sister. Their downfall, as justified as it felt, wasn't something I'd ever imagined witnessing. Rachel noticed my turmoil and reminded me why I'd taken this stand in the first place. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life. My family had made their choices, and now they were dealing with the consequences. It wasn't my responsibility to save them from themselves. Still, the weight of it lingered. As I sat in my apartment one evening, surrounded by the quiet comfort of a life I'd finally started building for myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. My parents and Emily might have fallen, but something told me they weren't done trying to pull me back into their chaos. The question was, would I let them? Breaking away from my family's manipulative grasp marked the start of a journey I had never imagined for myself. The first step was simple but monumental: cutting all ties. No more phone calls, no more messages, no more guilt trips disguised as family concerns. The silence was unnerving at first, but as days turned into weeks, I began to feel the weight lifting. It was liberating to finally prioritize my own needs without the constant pull of familial obligations. Rachel and I decided to refocus on the goals we'd set aside for far too long. We tightened our budget, mapped out a financial plan, and started saving for a home of our own. Every paycheck I put into that savings account felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming what had been taken from me. The years of struggle and sacrifice had taught me discipline, and now I was using it to build a future I could truly call my own. Months passed, and one day, we stumbled upon a listing for a modest house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't large or extravagant, but it had character: a small garden, a cozy living room, and enough space to grow. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I'd worked for, a testament to my resilience. The thought of finally having a place that was truly mine brought a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. The process of buying the house was a whirlwind. There were inspections, negotiations, and endless paperwork, but through it all, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Standing in the empty living room on the day we got the keys, I realized how far I'd come. This wasn't just a house. It was freedom. It was the end of a chapter filled with manipulation and the beginning of a life built on my terms. The decision to completely sever ties with my family wasn't an easy one, but it was necessary. My parents and Emily had made their choices, and now I was making mine. I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. This house, this life, was proof that I could stand on my own. Of course, the past has a way of creeping back in. Not long after settling into our new home, my father reached out. It started with a handwritten letter, carefully worded to seem heartfelt, but dripping with ulterior motives. He congratulated me on the house, mentioned how proud he was of my accomplishments, and then subtly hinted at how family always comes first. It didn't take long for the request to follow. He wanted me to consider helping them rebuild after their loss, perhaps even purchase a small property for them nearby. The audacity was almost laughable. I didn't respond. Instead, I put the letter away and returned to the life I'd fought so hard to build. Rachel and I spent our weekends painting walls, planting flowers in the garden, and turning the house into a home. Every corner of that place reflected our hard work and determination, and with each passing day, the shadows of my past grew fainter. Sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and pink, I felt a profound sense of peace. The road to get here hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, and to value my own happiness. This house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything I'd overcome. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Truly free.
Bye-bye.